What's up everybody, Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today we're going to be showing you how to install this Fox 2.5 suspension on your Ford Ranger. Now, I do want to make a quick note that as we're doing this install, you'll see that we're actually pulling out a Fox 2.0 coilover to replace it with this. The steps are going to be exactly the same as they would be if you were just pulling a factory strut out, so no need to get confused there. And overall, it's not too tricky of an install, just a little bit time consuming. So step one, as always, is going to be to remove your wheel and tire from in here so we can get access to the inside of the wheel well. Then once that's clear, we need to loosen up these brackets for our ABS and brake lines. So I'm going to take a 10mm socket. We'll loosen this one up first. And for this bracket, we're going to use an 8mm. With a bit of slack in the lines, we'll have some more room to play with. Now, we need to disconnect the sway bar, and what I'm going to do is undo this 18mm nut for the end link, and that'll give us the play we need later when we need to bring this forward. A lot of times these are seized up though, so if you can't get this free, you can come down underneath the frame over here and you can undo both the mounts for the sway bar on the frame on both sides and kind of drop the whole bar down, and I have done that before. It's a little bit more difficult, but it'll still get you what you need. So let's just get this nut off here first. Next, we need to loosen up the nut on this tie rod end so we can get the tie rod free, and that's going to be a 15mm deep well on this one. There we go. So to undo the ball joint from the upper control arm and the knuckle, you're going to need an 18mm socket that's deep well to go around that stud. But before we loosen this up, I usually like to loosen the frame mounts at the back, so that way there's not a bunch of tension on this upper arm and it isn't going to snap out of there when we get it free. So we're going to use some wrenches here to turn those real quick. Before I take this nut all the way off, we'll tap the end of the knuckle here with a hammer to try and get that upper arm free and make sure this ball joint isn't seized in here. And then I'm also actually going to grab a little pry tool here and pry these clips back for this line just to get us a little bit more slack since it's still kind of hanging down in front of the coilover. So now we're going to come back down to our tie rod end. We're going to hit this a few more times and try and get it free since this ball joint isn't pinned at an angle anymore, and we can move that knuckle. Now that we've got everything out of the way, we have the clearance we need to remove this coilover, or in your guys' case, your factory strut. So you're just going to need to remove the 3 nuts at the top as well as the bolts at the bottom that are holding it into that lower arm, and then we can put a little pressure on that arm and we should be able to work it out of here. Now, I've got our new Fox 2.5 coilover here, and they are marked right and left, so you do want to make sure you have the correct one for the side you're working on. And we're just going to kind of slide this into place. There, and as you can see, you just have a washer followed by the lock nut. So that's pretty simple. And then we also have 2 new bolts for the bottom mount here, so we can get those in to start pulling this all together. And then the resi is going to wrap around, and what you want to make sure is that it's going to go through your line here so your sensor wire isn't caught on the hose, because it's going to mount up over there in the frame later. So we'll get that out of the way, but let's grab the lower hardware. So with these lower mounts, a lot of times from Fox, they're not clocked completely right with the holes. It's not a big deal. You just basically need to kind of twist and rotate it. And if you put one of these bolts in here as a stud, you can use that as a handle or put a pry bar on it to twist it. And then you can also kind of rotate this back and forth to get it lined up with the holes. So ours is looking pretty close now. With everything threaded by hand, we've got it all in there, so all we need to do now is tighten it down for real. And the bottom's going to use a 19mm socket, the top's going to be a 17. As you're reassembling going back through, it's worth noting that everything here is just going to be torqued to factory spec. A lot of times what I'll do is reassemble it all and then come back at the end and torque it all down, so that way I can just go through one by one and double check that everything is tight and where it should be. So work on that as you go, but right now we want to grab this knuckle. We're going to bring it up into place so we can bring the upper control arm down, reattach that, and assemble everything around it. So we'll take the nut off our upper control arm here. There we go. So as you're bringing this up, sometimes the back of that axle there will kind of unseat and it'll start to give you some issues where you won't be able to line up your ball joint. Now, if you bring this down, we'll hold that in place. If you grab the lugs or kind of rotate from here, you can usually turn the axle as you're pushing forward and that'll get it to re-spline in, and your boot and everything will look normal once it's settled. So now that we've got that together, we'll put our nut on here just to hold it all. And we can start reassembling everything else. So let's bring our tie rod back around. We can take the nut off this. Pull that up through the knuckle. And then so we don't forget, let's also do the end link for our sway bar. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can't get this end link off, then right now you're just gonna wanna make sure you can go back through and reattach your sway bar at the frame mount, so that way you don't forget about it when we get to the next step. Okay, now let's tighten down these two nuts. Once again, it's gonna be an 18 at the top. And you'll see as I start turning it, it only gets a couple more threads on it before it starts spinning the actual stud for the ball joint. So what you'll need to do now is get a wrench that can hold that 18mm nut, and then another one to hold a socket or a wrench to hold the stud. So that way it's not just spinning infinitely and we can get this tight, and it'll be the same story down here for that tie rod. Now let's get our little plastic clips reattached to the upper control arm. We can put these brackets back in on the knuckle so everything is buttoned up. And then we'll also go back and tighten these frame mounts for that upper control arm since I loosened them a little bit. We just want to make sure that's on there solid, and then we can worry about that reservoir. We've got everything locked in here. One last quick little note, if these plastic tabs break on you, you can't get these two reattached, you can also run zip ties around the upper control arm and it'll still hold it pretty decently. What we need to do now is come around underneath the truck, and we're gonna remove this factory bash plate from the front so that way we have access to the underside of the frame rails, because that's where we're gonna be mounting this reservoir bracket. The bash plate here is just held on with 4 bolts underneath. These are 15mm to take them off, so we'll loosen all of these up and drop it down. With the skid plate free, you can see where I've kind of wiped this down, and I actually pre-drilled the holes that we're going to use for our reservoir bracket. So basically, it's going to need to tuck up right in here to where it's not going to hit anything, it's not going to hit the radiator or frame mounts or any of that, and then also you have access to your dials for the compression adjustments. So you're going to want to pay close attention here, because the way Fox explains this is a little confusing, but this first hole you're going to drill, you're going to need to go from your cross member, measure from the center of this about 7 inches out. So if you see Here, I'll bring a tape measure up, and that puts that hole right about 7 inches, and then it's kind of centered in this first section of the frame. Now, once you have that clear, you're going to punch that hole with a 7/32 inch drill bit all the way through, and you want to make sure when you do these holes, you can see here that you can get that drill bit pretty far up in there and you're getting lots of clearance for the screws so they're not going to hit the second layer of metal inside. Then once you've done that, you can bring your bracket up and you can kind of use that as a template to figure out where this second hole is going to fit. So as you can see, I've got them pretty much perfectly dialed in there, and they give you 2 self-tapping screws that are going to go through. And that's why you do want to make sure you get these holes right, because they are self-tappers, so you really only get 1 or 2 shots at this before you start messing things up. All right, with the frame mounted bracket in place, now we just need to get the reservoir attached. And thankfully, Fox actually gives you some nice aluminum brackets to hold this instead of just regular hose clamps. So you're just gonna need an Allen key to loosen these up. And we'll slide this first one over the actual body of the reservoir. And you can kind of use those square cutouts in the bracket to determine where these need to sit to make sure you get this all centered up right. Now I'll bring the second bracket over the front here. Try to be mindful as you're tightening these up to go back and forth and get it pulled together evenly instead of just cranking down one of the screws and having the other one not reach the threads. That's going to be a wrap on installing the front coilovers, and everything's looking good. Like I said, you just want to go back through, make sure it's all tightened to spec. So now let's move around to the rear of the truck, which thankfully is quite a bit easier, and we'll get those shocks popped in. To remove your rear shocks, you're going to want to come down to this lower mount and grab a ratchet and a 15mm socket to back the bolt out, and then we can swing this forward. Moving up to the top shock mount here, we're going to remove this bolt as well so we can drop the whole shock out of the truck. Also be careful not to lose the nut up here that's on the other side of this bolt, because it'll just drop straight down if you don't hold it. Now we just need to bring our new Fox 2.5 shock up into place, and you want your adjusters pointed downward so the body is upward towards the bed. And we're just going to reuse the factory hardware to tighten everything in. So that's all it takes to get the rear shocks installed, and with that, it's going to complete this whole Fox 2.5 system. Now, one last thing that I do want to know is once you've got everything installed on your truck, since you've been altering suspension geometry and these are going to adjust the ride height of the vehicle, you do want to make sure that you get this professionally aligned, or else you're going to get some weird tire wear issues and it may not track straight on the road. So definitely have a shop do that once you have it all complete. Now, if you are interested in picking up one of these Fox 2.5 systems for your Ranger, you can head down in the description below, click those links, they're going to shoot you over to our website. And as always, thank you guys for watching.